shoes. We see my grandparents on my father's side were always bickering all the time immemorial. My grandmother was a very bossy woman, and as the years rolled on, their battles grew more fierce, and after every last battle, my grandpa would say, "You know what? When I die, I'm going to haunt you." Well, we got the call from Grandma. Grandpa died that one night, and she asked me to make the funeral arrangements. Well, I tried, I did my best. The first thing in order was to prepare his clothes to be buried in, and went to his wardrobe. And Grandpa had a very nice, systematic way of putting his clothes together, very fastidious. He had a line of shoes. They're always in their proper place. He had his Sunday brown shoes, going to church shoes, he used to call them. Then he had his going to town shoes, right in the middle. Then he had his work shoes, and so forth. Well, my grandmother decided that he should be buried in his Sunday brown going to church shoes, and we could get rid of the other shoes because nobody had his size and it wouldn't fit, and to heck with it. And he was buried in those shoes. Several years later, it was my grandmother's turn to leave this earth. And my mother, Ma, said to go over and clean out the house. Well, I did, but she said, "Why don't you go during the day?" Because Grandma always said the place was haunted. In fact, she said it was haunted by Grandpa. She said, in fact, Grandma took to sleeping during the day because he kept her up all night with his walking. Well, I laughed at that. And then my little daughter came up and she said she never liked sleeping over there. She's only 6 years old at the time. She never liked sleeping over there at Grandma's because there was always the constant walking about by somebody. Well, I told her it was probably a wood beam creaking or just her imagination. And I went over to clean the house in broad daylight. Well, I cleaned out the bottom half of the house, and then I had lunch, and I decided to go upstairs to the bedroom area and clean out Grandpa's wardrobe, and there was his suits all lined up with dust, and at the bottom were a pair of brown Sunday going to church shoes with fresh dew on it and bits of grass and mold. I did not stay to see if his good suit was there.
A very self-possessed young lady of 15 said, "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Reidel." Did I sound like a 15-year-old girl?
No.
Oh dear. Did I sound self-possessed? Possessed, perhaps? Oh, that's not important. Regardless, she was addressing a Mr. Reidel, who was in a state of recovering his nerves. Recovering from what we do not know. But his sister had instructed him to get some rest in the country and had provided letters of introduction for that purpose. Hence, this meeting in the foyer of a little summer cottage. "Do you know many people around here?" she asked.
"Hardly so. My sister stayed in the rectory 4 years ago and provided me this letter of introduction."
The young girl suddenly looked sad. "Then you know nothing of my aunt?"
"Only her name and address."
"Her great tragedy happened 3 years ago. That would be after your sister's stay."
"Tragedy?"
She motioned toward the open window. She said, You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon. 3 years ago, to this day, my aunt's husband and brothers went out for their day's shooting. They never came back. As they crossed the moor to their favorite shooting ground, they were all engulfed in a terrible bog. Their bodies were never recovered. That's the dreadful part of it. Poor aunt. Poor aunt. Always thinks they'll come back to her. They and that little brown spaniel that was lost to them. Poor auntie always used to tell me how they went out that night with her husband with his coat over his arm and her younger brother calling out, "Bertie, why do you bound?" the way he always did, just to tease her, because he knew it got on her nerves. You know, sometimes on still nights like this, I get this creepy feeling that they can come right through that window. Just then the aunt bustled in with a whirl of apologies for being late. "I hope you don't mind the open window," she said. "My husband and brothers will be in directly from their day's shooting, and they've been out in the marsh and will make a fine muddy mess of my carpets." To Mr. Nuttall, it was all too horrible to hear her rattle on about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the season. He desperately tried to change this topic to something less ghastly by describing in detail all his infirmaments, ailments and their causes and cures.
On the matter of diet, the doctors are not entirely in agreement, he droned on and on.
No, the aunt tried to suppress a yawn, and then suddenly brightened. "Oh, there they are, just in time for tea, and muddy up to their eyes." Mr. Nuttall looked sympathetically at the niece. The niece was staring out the window as well, with a dazed look of horror in her eyes. Mr. Nuttall looked as well. There, in the deepening twilight, 3 figures approached the house. One with a white coat. A tired brown spaniel kept close to their heels. Noiselessly they approached, until a young voice called out, "Bertie, why do you bound?" Mr. Nuttall grabbed his hat and walking stick and scrambled headlong out the front door. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the Macintosh coat coming through the window. "Who is that bolted out the front door?" "A most extraordinary man," said the aunt. "All he could do is speak of his illness and then dashed off without a fare thee well. You'd think he'd seen a ghost." "It must have been the terrier," said the young self-possessed girl. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He'd once been hunted into a cemetery on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs. Had to spend the night in an open grave with the beast snarling and foaming over him. It's enough to make anyone lose their nerve." Romance on short notice was her speciality.
From the police blotter of Seekonk, Massachusetts, Joseph Wolfe was driving along the Route 44. And this was his comment. "Well, I was in my car, and all of a sudden on the right side, on the passenger window, I saw a face pressed in, grinning at me. It was a weird, bizarre apparition, to say the least, because I was driving 50 miles per hour. I took hold, drove, swerved off the highway. I wish accomplished quite a few things at that moment. And then got out, checked around by the passenger door, and nothing. Nothing at all. That happened 25 years ago, and believe me, I'm still shaken up by it.
The shortest ghost story ever written. Ready for it?
Yeah.
There was the last man in the world, and he heard a knock on the door. Yeah, I know, everybody tells me I look just like the guy that was sitting over there. Dublin's fair city, where the girls are so pretty. I first laid my eyes on sweet Molly Malone, and she wheeled her wheelbarrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh. Well, she was a fishmonger, and sure 'twas no wonder, for so were her mother and father before. And they each wheeled their barrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh. Well, she died of a fever, and no one could save her, and that was the end of sweet Molly. Now a ghost wheels her barrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh. Everybody now, come on. Alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh. One more time. Alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
Hill House has stood for 90 years. It may stand for 90 more. Within, walls continue upright, bricks meet, floors are firm, and doors are sensibly shut. Silence weighs steadily upon the stone and wood of Hill House, for we who walk there walk alone. know. I went when Martin wasn't looking. I came all the way out from the window, and the ledge was only 4 inches wide. I could have been killed and broke my neck, but I didn't. I slid down the drain pipe, and here I am. He promised me, oh, take me away from here. I beg of you. But he came to my window, and he said, not by words, but by doing things. He waved his arm, and there was a vast cloud of red mist, and in the mist were little red eyes like his. Rats, hundreds of them, thousands of them, millions of them, filled with blood, a saturnalia of blood. All these, he said, as I promised you, if you will obey. Oh, take me away from here. They say I will have blood on my hands. Oh, how can I? For he does not damn those with weak minds. Dracula? I've never heard of that name before. But he's here. He's here with all of us. I'll show you. Master? We're here. We're here. I know you can't hear me, but we're here.
Advantages that India has over England is a certain great knowability. After 5 years' service, a man becomes directly or indirectly acquainted with 200 to 300 civilians in his province, 10 to 12 regiments, and some 1,500 people of non-official castes. In 10 years, his knowledge should be doubled, and after 20 years, he knows or knows something about almost every Englishman in the empire, and may travel anywhere and everywhere without paying hotel bills. My doctor tells me I need rest and a change of air. It is not improbable that I shall have both ere long. In the meantime, I resolve to stay where I am, and in flat defiance of my doctor's orders, to bring all of you into my confidence. You shall learn for yourselves the precise nature of my malady. 3 years ago, it was my fortune, my great misfortune, to sail to Bombay with one Agnes Wessington, the wife of an officer. Be content to know that when our voyage had ended, we were both desperately and unreasonably in love with each other. But from the first day of our ill-omened attachment, I was aware that her passion was a stronger, a more dominant, if I may use the expression, a purer sentiment than mine. Arrived at Bombay, we went our respective ways and met no more for 3 to 4 months until my leave and her love brought us both to Simla. There we spent the season together until my fire of straw burnt itself out to a pitiful end. And she learned from my own lips in 1882 that I was sick of her presence, tired of her company, and weary of the sound of her voice. But on her, neither my openly expressed aversions nor the cutting brutalities with which I garnished our interviews had the least effect. Jack, I'm sure it's all a mistake. Please forgive me, and we shall be as good friends again. Please, Jack. whenever we would inadvertently meet, this was her lament. Always this incessant wail that it was all a mistake, and this hope that we would somehow be friends again. I might have noticed, had I cared to look, that she was becoming more wan and thin, day by day. It was that hope that was the only thing that was keeping her alive. I could have been kinder, but still. The following year, 1884, marked the beginning of my courtship with the little Kitty Mannering. All my hopes, doubts, and fears, our long rides together, my trembling vow of attachment, her reply, our love. But every now and then, a rickshaw would flit by with that familiar wave of Mrs. Wessington's hand. And when we would meet alone, which was but seldom, the same monotonous refrain. In August, Kitty and I were engaged. I truly loved her, and with my love for Kitty grew my hatred for Agnes. The following day, I encountered those accursed Jean-Panis pulling her yellow-paneled rickshaw and stopped to tell her everything. She knew it already. "So, Jack, dear, I hear you're engaged. I'm sure it's all a mistake, a hideous mistake, and we shall be as good friends, Jack, as we ever were." My curt reply cut the woman before me like a crack of a whip. "Please forgive me, Jack. I didn't mean to make you angry, but it's true. It's true." And then she broke down completely. 10 minutes later, I met Kitty on horseback, and in the delight of a long ride with her, forgot all about Agnes. A week later, Mrs. Wessington died, and the unbearable burden of her existence was removed. Before 3 months had passed, I had forgotten all about her. It was April, and Kitty and I were to be married in June. I was the happiest man in all of India. On April 15th, we were in Thompson's shop where her finger was being fitted for the ring. And then afterwards, we rode down the hot lanes of Simla together, laughing amid the clatter and chatter of the marketplace. And I became aware of a voice, apparently at a vast distance, calling out my Christian name. It struck me that I'd heard the voice before, but when and where, I could not at once determine. Immediately opposite Politti's pub, my eye was arrested by the sight of 4 black and white Jean-Panis and a yellow-paneled rickshaw. "Look, Kitty," I cried. "There are poor Mrs. Wessington's Jean-Panis turned up again. I wonder who has them now." "What? Where?" Kitty asked. "I don't see them anywhere." Just then, her horse, swerving to avoid a lame mule, threw itself directly into the path of the advancing rickshaw. To my horror, horse and rider passed through men and carriage, as if they were thin air. "Why did you call out, Jack? What was the matter?" she cried. There was plenty of room between the mule and the veranda wall, and then Kitty rode off in disdain. What was the matter? Nothing indeed. I reined in my horse, turned around, and the rickshaw turned too and now stood facing me. "Jack, dear, please forgive me, Jack. I'm sure it's all a mistake, a hideous mistake, and we shall be as good friends again." The rickshaw hood fell back, and there, as I hope and pray for the death I dread by night, sat Mrs. Wessington, handkerchief in hand, golden head bowed. How long I stood still, I do not know. I tumbled off my horse and dashed into Politti's for a glass of cherry brandy, and after what seemed like an eternity, I heard Kitty's voice outside inquiring for me. A minute later, she was inside, prepared to upbraid me roundly. But something in my face stopped her. "Jack, what's the matter? Are you ill?" In a panic, I told her the sun had been too much for me, but it was nearly 5 o'clock on a cloudy afternoon, and the sun had been hidden all afternoon. I realized my mistake as soon as the words were out of my mouth. But it was too late. Kitty had stormed off while I mumbled something about feeling faint and rode off to my hotel room alone, leaving Kitty to finish the ride alone. There in my hotel room, I sat down and tried to reason out the matter. Here I was, Jack Pansay, educated Bengal civilian, presumably sane, certainly healthy, driven in terror from my sweetheart's side by the apparition of a woman who had been dead and buried 8 months ago. The next morning, I sent a penitent note to Kitty imploring her forgiveness. I explained I'd been attacked with a sudden palpitation of the heart, the result of indigestion. The note had its intended effect. That afternoon, we rode out together with the shadow of the first lie dividing us. Nothing would please us save a canter around town. The canter turned into a gallop, and as a fitting climax, there, on a level stretch of road, the terror awaited me. No other rickshaws were in sight. Only the 4 black and white Jampanis, the yellow-paneled rickshaw, and the golden head of the woman I left 8 months ago. For an instant, I fancied Kitty must see what I saw, but her next words dispelled that notion. Not a soul in sight. Come along, Jack. Let's race. Her arrow was off like a bird, mine close behind, and just as before, her rickshaw passed through the rickshaw. Her horse passed through the rickshaw. This time, mine following. Jack, dear. The words rang through my ears. I'm sure it's all a mistake. A hideous mistake. Please forgive me, Jack. Kitty bantered me about my silence for the rest of the trip. We were to dine with her family that evening, and I barely had time to ride home and dress. But I did, and on my way to the Mannering home, I encountered 2 men talking together in the dusk, and I overheard their conversation. And from this, I learned that all 4 of Mrs. Wessington's Jampanis, they were brothers, had died of cholera shortly after her death. Her heirs, believing the rickshaw cursed, had it destroyed. So, there were ghosts of rickshaws after all. And ghostly employments in other lands, other worlds. I wonder what she paid her men. What were their hours? Where did they go? And for a visible answer, I solved the infernal thing. The dead travel fast and by paths unknown to ordinary coolies. I laughed aloud and checked it, for fear I was going mad. Perhaps I was. I reined in my horse, politely wished Mrs. Wessington a very good evening. Her answer I knew only too well, but I listened to the end and replied that I'd heard it all before, but should be delighted if she had anything further to say.
Matters a hatter, poor devil, a drunk. Max, see if you can get him to go home.
Surely that was not Mrs. Wessington's voice. No, the 2 men I had overheard now overheard me and bade me home. I apologized confusedly and assured them of my sobriety and sanity, and arrived 10 minutes late at Kitty's, where I was rebuked for my unlover-like tardiness. After some tender small talk, we enjoyed the dinner party, where my attention was immediately drawn to a red-whiskered man regaling of an encounter he had had that evening with a mad unknown. 2 sentences convinced me that he was reporting on the incident of half an hour ago. Halfway through his story, his eye caught mine, and he immediately stopped, muttered something about forgetting the rest, and mercifully ended his tale. After the dinner, the red-whiskered man, who had been introduced to me as Dr. Heatherly, offered to accompany me home as far as our paths may lay together. I accepted his offer with gratitude. It was good that I did. It lay in waiting, this time tauntingly equipped with a lighted headlamp. Heatherly went to the point at once.
I say, Pansy, what on earth was the matter with you this evening on the Asilium Road?
That, I said, pointing to it. This time, the rickshaw, instead of waiting for us, stayed about 20 yards ahead of us, regardless of our speed. I told the doctor almost everything I've told you. He mused he saw nothing.
Eyes, Pansy. It's all eyes, brain, and stomach. The greatest of these is stomach. Get the stomach straight, and the rest follows. I shall take sole medical charge of you from this hour. You're too fascinating a phenomenon to be passed over.
We arrived at Dr. Heatherly's after midnight, and his attempts towards my cure commenced almost immediately. For the next week, I never left his sight. Cold baths, liver pills, and strong exercise were his regimen. But no walking or riding outside to support our ruse that I'd ridden to Kitty, feigning recovery from a sprain. Day by day, my spirits began to lift, and I came to believe the doctor's spectral illusion theory implicating eyes, brain, and stomach. My recovery progressed so well that in a week's time, I found myself in Kitty's drawing room, feeling more alive than ever, and secure in knowing I would never see it again. Intoxicated in my newfound happiness, I encouraged a ride at once, and oh, did we ever ride. The horses did their best, but they were far too slow. I was too impatient. "Jack," Kitty cried, "what are you doing? You're behaving like a child." "Doing?" I cried. "What, nothing, dear. That's just it. If you'd done nothing all week but lie up, you'd be as riotous as I." The words were hardly out of my lips before we rounded the corner. And there, in the middle of the road, were the 4 black and white liveries, the yellow-paneled rickshaw, and Mrs. Wessington. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground with Kitty kneeling over me in tears. "Has it gone?" I gasped. "Has what gone, Jack? What does it all mean? There must be a mistake somewhere. A hideous mistake." Her last words brought me to my feet, mad raving. "Yes," I said, "a hideous mistake." Grabbing her by the wrist, "Come, look at it." I took her to where it stood and implored her to speak to it, to tell it we were betrothed, that neither death nor hell could break the bind that bound us. I begged the terror in the rickshaw to bear witness to all I had said, and to release me from this torment that was killing me. As I spoke, I must have told Kitty all about my former relations with Mrs. Wessington. I watched Kitty as she listened intently, her white eyes and face blazing. "Thank you, Mr. Pansy. That's quite enough. Bring me my horse." Seven days later, I received a packet of my letters to Kitty and the ring. The doctor tried to make amends and treating remedies, but all I heard now was a din, for I had taken to riding endlessly through the town and countryside. Or should I say we? For what many had claimed to be eccentricities was now hushily called madness, and people gave us wide berth in the street whenever we would appear. Weeks passed, and I would chance upon Kitty. She ignored me. Sometimes we would find ourselves couples transversing the streets of Simla. Kitty with her new riding partner, and me with Agnes. I now know I can never leave or ford any river, for the presence of the rickshaw fills me by turns with dread, horror, a dim sort of pleasure, and utter despair. Pity me at least
feast on the score of my delusion, for I know you'll never believe what I'm telling you. In justice to pity her. For as sure as any woman was ever killed by a man, I killed Mrs. Wessington. And the last portion of my punishment is even now upon me. Jack, dear, I'm sure it's all a mistake. Please forgive me, and we shall be as good friends again someday. Jack, dear, Jack, Jack.
Harry and Sheena Hansen were driving on October 22nd in the evening in their car, which broke down en route 44. Right on the border of Seekonk, Massachusetts. Harry said and reported to the police on their blotter, the car was broken down. I left my cell phone on the coffee table. And I decided I'd look around to see if I could get a phone so I could call up AAA. So I left my wife in the car, and I went down a parcel of the road, and there I seen a guy sitting on the curb, blue jeans, and a plaid shirt, sloppy looking with red hair. And I strode up to him and I said, you know, I was wondering if there was a payphone or any phone around here I could call. And, you know, he didn't say anything. He sat there, grinning. I said, you know, if there's any phone around here, you might let me know if you know farmhouse or any and then something odd happened. I noticed in his eyes they were clouded over, white. And his grin twisted. And then I heard him start to laugh. And I felt a little peculiar. And I decided to walk the opposite way. And I still heard him laugh, and I turned around and he was gone. But then I heard the laugh on one side, then to the left of me, and then in front of me. And I went over to the car, and there was poor Sheena, shivering. She said that she had heard on the radio the music was playing, and then it stopped, and all of a sudden, someone or something was calling her name. Well, we never got over that. We finally got a car, finally, and it took us. And next day, got the car towed, and you know, to this day, I try to understand what it was, and in a way, I'm not sure I want to even know what it was.
Beware, my dear, the evening time, my dear, when sun sets low and shadows grow and daydreams turn to fear.
And peacocks cease their mournful cry and wail amidst the darkened sky. Beware, my dear, the evening time, in peace they fly in truth.
Let that be so.
Let that be so, let that be true.
To that loved one dressed in black, Beware, my dear, the evening time.
They sometimes do come back.